Hey everyone, today we're tearing down a Gigabyte GTX 1080 Xtreme WaterForce card, or something like that. It's got a lot of words in the name. So this is another liquid-cooled GTX 1080, we sometimes call them GTX 1080 hybrids. This one is really not true to that name, so when we use the word hybrid with this site anyway, it's generally referring to the idea of having a VRM or a VRAM blower fan here, and cooling the VRAM that way, and then using the liquid for the rest, for the GPU. This card is different. You can see that without even tearing it down through the window, because the CLC is outfitted here atop the GPU, as one would expect. And then just like the EVGA hybrid that we tore apart, and we should have B-roll of that, there's a copper plate underneath the CLC that communicates with the CLC cold plate and the VRAM. So the VRAM heat is synced by the copper plate, and the copper plate touches the cold plate. There's probably on this one, but definitely on the EVGA one, thermal paste between the point of contact, and that helps sync the heat from the VRAM copper plate into the cold plate through the CLC. And the idea there is that your GPU diode temperature will look like it's higher than maybe a Seahawk, and that's because the GPU is sharing its cooling solution with the VRAM, and there's only so much cooling potential in one of these. Something like an EK Predator would be better, and we do have one of those to look at. But this one's even different still. It's got a heat pipe in here. Heat pipe probably goes down over the VRAM, or the VRM, the actual voltage regulator module, not just the VRAM or the memory. So we're going to tear it apart and look at it. We've got a full review as well. That'll go live very soon, so subscribe if you want to see that. But let's take it apart today. First of all, I want to thank Sean, one of our viewers, for sending this over to us. This is now the second card we've worked on from a viewer. First was from Sam. That was the Titan X. Thank you again for that, Sam. And Sean, thank you for sending this. So let's take it apart and be a bit more careful with it than with my own cards, because it does actually need to be used at the end of all of this. So we're going to start with the Shroud screws. Take those out. These are just Phillips head, A1 or A2 it looks like are both fine. Very large screw. Okay, I need to remember this. Okay, so a few seconds into this, we already have like 3 or 4 different sizes of screws. I wasn't planning to use the magnetic sheet thing, but we're going to use it. And that's because these are unexpectedly different sizes. Okay, so Shroud's ready to come off. Pretty easy. Got some connections in here. Let me see what all these are first. So this one is the Extreme Gaming LED, which, how is this held in? Okay, so this is held in by these 3 screws, and these actually don't need to come out to remove the shroud. So those are only used for this, and that would be why they're different sizes. One of them, I guess, this one theoretically goes into the board, so where does that go? Yeah, it does go. So right there, that, I don't know if you can see that under my pinky, there's on this aluminum heatsink, there's a screw hole. So that's where that really long one goes through the nameplate and then into the heatsink. And then the power, this cable at the top is going to the LED on the nameplate. And then these are in there pretty good. Okay, there we go. Just required some pressure on the pin. So that goes to the nameplate. And then we've got the LED here. So there's your diodes, your light emitting diodes. You can see RGB, RGB. So there's 2 sets of RGB LEDs. And then this is the actual nameplate, diffuser, all that stuff. So that's that part of the board. And then these go to more LEDs, it looks like. Let's get those disconnected so we get the shroud separated. Okay. All right, so there's your shroud. Really nothing special. The only cool thing, I guess, is the see-through plastic. But we'll put that aside and let's start looking at the board. I might take the back plate off. Or definitely take the cooler off of the GPU though. Some of the cables we've disconnected here. This is for the fan. We can see that's clearly the fan. And then this connects the pump to the same power. So these connect, and that communicates with the motherboard directly. And that's what powers our pump and our fan. So that's what that is. And then looking at the cooler I was talking about, same setup as EVGA, but even still a bit more sophisticated from what they were doing. Gigabyte's got a copper plate here that's touching the VRAM, the memory. We can see very clearly there's a thermal pad between the copper and the VRAM. And then that has a heat pipe attached to the copper plate over here on one set of the VRAM. So this set's going to be pretty darn cold. And the copper heat pipe is communicating down this channel. We actually have an animation of how heat pipes work from our How CPU Coolers Work video. Same thing as with CPU coolers. So this is connected to an aluminum heatsink. It might be copper under there, we'll find out. This raised part is where the MOSFETs and the inductors kind of are. Inductors don't really need this much cooling, but it's smack in the middle of the MOSFETs and the capacitor bank, so I guess they decided, well, we'll just cool it anyway because it's easier than not cooling it. So this sinks the MOSFETs, capacitor bank, and the inductors, and then the heat pipe pulls all that heat away, transfers it to this copper plate, and then that transfers to the pump eventually. So it's a pretty inefficient process in that regard versus something like an open loop where you have one block from maybe EK that's just filled with liquid and cools everything. But that is how this one works. We have thermal charts that we'll look at in the review and talk about more specifically if it's good or not. But that's how it works. That's what we're interested in right now. Let's pull off the back plate, but first the actual cooler. Oh, this is actually going to stay on there until all of these are taken out this time because they are mounting other parts of the cooler, not just the GPU cooler itself. Okay, there's a couple screws on the top side, which you can see are connecting right here. So there's screws right there on the top side and probably over here as well, where you can see the back and the nut. So let's take this out. Let's take off the I/O shield and then progress from there. Okay, so shield's off and those screws are done. This, I just want to point out, I'm not sure if Gigabyte advertises these as gold-plated HDMI for VR. I'll have to check their marketing language for the review, but it's still stupid. Gold-plated any connector, well, any connector in computing, USB mostly, does nothing for you. We've done a video on that. It genuinely does nothing for you. In this case, the gold plating, so to speak, is the actual housing of the connector, but the pins themselves are still normal pins. This is just housing. It doesn't communicate anything. All the pins do all the work. On USB especially, that's true. When you see keyboards advertising gold-plated whatever for faster response and therefore better for esports, it's all BS. So these would perform the same if they were silver, is what I'm saying. And the one in the back, are these gold-plated as well? Or gold shiny? I think they are. They are. These are also gold plated, though the camera light makes them look a little silver. So that's dumb and pointless and does nothing. So is this loose yet? What's the deal here? That's also loose. Okay, there we go. It's got a thermal pad holding it on or something. Yes. Okay, it's all come apart now. All right, so here's what we've got. This is the VRM. You can see that some of the thermal pad has remained on the cooler. That's fine, we'll reapply it once we rebuild this thing later. Thermal paste, obviously, applied by a machine or by hand with a silk screen or something. With decent coverage and good contact too. You can tell by the pattern that's good contact. It was definitely on there tight. Mounting standoffs, a whole bunch of screws that are triangle shaped. Okay, we don't have that size for the triangles, but that's what the underside looks like. This communicates with VRAM. This communicates with VRAM, and this communicates with VRAM. There are 8 memory modules. Those 8 memory modules on a GTX 1080 are all GDDR5X by Micron. And then this is for, right here is the MOSFET cooling. You can see it's an aluminum plate, which is about 205 watts per meter Kelvin or so thermal conductivity at 25C. This is contacting the inductors, which can handle upwards of 120C. So they don't need this plate, but it's here anyway. And an inductor is basically a copper wire, so it's sort of a heatsink in its own. And then this right here is for the capacitor bank, and that pretty much covers the solution. So here's what's going on. It's actually pretty clever. This is contacting the VRAM directly, and it's through here under my finger, which we're probably not going to take this completely apart because I have to send it back and I don't want liquid to get out of the system. But under here is the copper plate for part of the liquid cooler, the pump, which is what we have right here. That's the pump in this solution. So if we look at it from this angle, is this the best angle? Yes, this is the best angle. If you look at it here where my finger is, you'll see that it's got its own copper plate, and that's sandwiched hard against this one for the VRAM. And that plate is what's pulling the heat off of this plate, which is pulling the heat off the VRAM and the VRM. And if I flip it over, you will see that through the middle, they've cut out a hole in the surface of the VRAM cooling plate where a protrusion from the GPU pump cold plate is sticking out. So this is connected directly to a cold plate at the bottom of the pump that is part of the cold plate of the pump, and it's protruded like we've seen in other models. That talks to the GPU directly, and one, it adds some copper mass, which helps with sinking the heat, and two, it means that the GPU is directly connected to the pump, so there's no efficiency loss there by communicating through multiple layers of copper, which is what the VRAM and the VRM are both doing, but they are much lower heat devices that can tolerate the temperature they're producing, so they don't need quite as efficient cooling as the GPU gets. So that's the solution. Heat pipe is connected to the copper soldered to the aluminum, and the aluminum's talking to the VRM completely. And I believe we can probably now take this off as well. Yes, there's one more screw right there. That one was hidden under the heatsink, I think, or I just missed it. Okay, so that's gone. Falls off. Perfect. All right, so backside's actually got some hardware on it too. It's not like every other PCB we've looked at. I'll have BuildZoid analyze this for us if he hasn't already done it on his own channel. You can see more of the VRM components continuing on this backside right here, and that's where the VRAM is mounted. So you can see 2 here, 3 here, 3 here, and 2 here. So that's 8, which obviously you see it on the other side as well. Some kind of logic on the backside. Some of these ICs are not my specialty, so we will have BuildZoid look at those for us. But you can definitely see continuation of VRAM, or the VRM, excuse me, over here. And then the rest of it is all pretty straightforward. So I'll see if I can have him look at that if he hasn't already. But that is the PCB itself. You've seen the front and the back of the PCB. These connections are basically LEDs, power for the fan, lots of LEDs though. And the cooler itself, over here, we just talked about all this, so I won't do that again. This is the radiator, obviously. The radiator has rigid tubing. This is not the same rubberized tubing that you'll see with Ace-Attack or most Cool IT, those types of products necessarily, but you can kind of hear the noise it makes. That's because it's rigid. I'm doing that because you probably can't really see it on the camera. So it is the bendy straw style tubing, if you think of what that looks like. And then you've got the barbs here, as always, with the tube connecting to the barb, tank for the radiator, tank on the other side. So it's every other radiator you've ever seen. And the fan is a Gigabyte branded fan, not special for any particular reason, though I'm sure they will find many reasons to tell you that it is special. And then, what else is there of note? Nothing really. These tubes, like every other one, you'll pretty much want to mount them like that to minimize the amount of air getting sucked through the pump, and it doesn't really damage performance, but it creates noise. So this card is fairly loud, with gurgling noises and things like that from the liquid if you mount it with the tubes up. So don't do that. We'll talk about all that in the review. So that's the teardown. That is the Gigabyte 1080 Xtreme with no E at the front and a capital X WaterForce graphics card. And it's a lot of thermal pads. So like, making fun of the name or not, this is actually pretty well built, thermally especially. Thermal solution's pretty unique and cool. The only card out that we've looked at that does something similar to this is EVGA's Hybrid. And EVGA's Hybrid was a big experiment because we were trying to figure out, why does this card produce higher temperatures than the Seahawk when it really shouldn't? It should be cooler for many reasons. And the answer was voltage, and was because they're cooling, most importantly, the VRAM with the same liquid cooling solution, just like Gigabyte's doing here. And so that means you're sharing the solution between multiple components. That increases the liquid temperature. The small 120 radiator, same on Gigabyte, is only capable of dissipating so much heat. It's not necessarily a bad thing for the GPU, because that can certainly run, even at 30 C delta, it's still pretty happy. So there's a point where the efficacy becomes questionable when you're cooling a GPU below 20 C delta, because it's just, what's the point to some regard. But I do have some coverage about that. We'll talk about that more in the future. But this same thing here. You're going to see higher GPU diode temperatures because you're cooling multiple things with a 120 radiator, 120 fan, limited amount of liquid. Liquid temperature goes up, dissipation potential goes down. Well, potential stays the same, but it's being shared by more devices. So that's the card. As always, links in the description below for photos, things like that. Our review is forthcoming, and you can subscribe to the channel to find the review of this card when it goes live. Patreon link, the post-roll video to help us out directly. We will be in California for a week, so the videos we're shooting from here on will either be scheduled to upload, or you'll be watching stuff from our California coverage at different manufacturers and at an iBuyPower esports arena opening at UCI. So tune in for all that stuff. I'll see you all next time.